Welcome, everyone, to our exciting second International Conference of Community Psychology, Fostering and Sustaining Solidarities webinar. I'll begin by acknowledging the Bunurong and Waimaire of the Kulin, on whose land I speak to you from today. I acknowledge all the traditional owners here in Australia, from those who have their country covered in cities of concrete and urban sprawl, to those in regional and remote spaces, and to those who are struggling to hold and push back against multinationals and governments who wish to continue to desecrate country to reach minerals, gas, and fossil fuels. I acknowledge these traditional owners and all Aboriginal and First Nation people who continue to suffer from the deep trauma of colonialism. And yet, we are all imagining, creating, and maintaining cultural knowledge and law that gives strength, resilience, and connection to each other, to our communities, and to Mother Earth, our country. I acknowledge all traditional owners across Australia and across the world and pay my deepest respect to them and honour their wisdom, compassion, and knowledge. I thank them for being, doing, and knowing. I also wish to acknowledge our esteemed panellists, Professor Pat Dudgeon, Professor Linda Waimaire Nikora, and Core Professor Nuria Ciofalo, for giving us their time and knowledge today in this final online webinar. I pay my respect to the traditional owners of land on which they join us from today. All of our panellists empower Aboriginal, Maori and First Nation peoples in equal partnerships that develop research and praxis that has an impact in and for people and communities. And they do this with community in respectful relationships. This webinar is in anticipation of and leading up to our postponed International Conference of Community Psychologists. The virtual format and launch date announcement will be coming soon, so keep your eyes out for that. Our webinar today is titled Indigenous Knowledge, Decolonisation and Radical Imagination. But before I hand you over to our moderator, Mohi, some Zoom etiquette. Our format will be an address from each member of the panel, followed by discussion and then Q&A from the audience. As the audience, you can participate in the Q&A during each panel member's presentation by submitting questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I encourage you to use this option while the panel is speaking. Questions will be answered during the moderated Q&A at the end. General chat can take place using the chat button at the bottom of the screen. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be available on the ICCP 2020 YouTube channel. Thank you and welcome to Mohi to open the session.
Kia ora everybody, and thank you Karen for that opening, and I'd like to support your comments and about welcoming everybody and acknowledging Indigenous Australian and Torres Strait Island people. My role as moderator is to introduce the panel for today. And the first one is Professor Pat Dudgeon, who is from the Bardi people of the Kimberley in Western Australia. She was the first Aboriginal psychologist to graduate in Australia and has made an outstanding contribution or contributions to Indigenous psychology and higher education. Pat is considered one of the founding people of Indigenous psychology. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Pat.
I'm doing share video and unmute. Yes, it's all happening. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Mohi. Thank you, Victoria University of Technology, for hosting this important webinar. I'm very pleased to be a part of it. just a little, I'd like to acknowledge country as well. I'd like to acknowledge our elders, past and present and forthcoming. And I'd like to acknowledge all the Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people who are attending the webinar today. So acknowledgements to all. We have just a short time to present in, so I'll try not to rev it on for too long. But I think this is an important webinar. I think this is an important place in time that we all are situated in. I think that with COVID-19, Black Lives Matter movement, there's a change coming, certainly. And in my time as a psychologist, as an Indigenous person, I've witnessed a lot of change, and most of it is very, very positive too, and augurs well for the future. But I think that we've seen the emergence of an Indigenous psychology, of a psychology that's intent on decolonising. And that's important for all of us, not just for those who were formerly excluded from the discipline, but for all of us as human beings, because each culture has brings various strengths and insights and knowledges into the space. So that's important as well. So Tony have a psychology that's very Western, is limiting, it's wrong, but it is it's not complete. So I've been very pleased to be a part of that movement, and I think challenging Western psychology is an important first step. But in my little presentation, which I'm probably using up too much of my time, I'd like to just quickly speak about some of the Indigenous psychologies that are coming forward. And in particular, I'm going to ask the technical support to show my PowerPoint now. Yes? Or should I try and do it? I don't know. Okay. That's it. Okay, so I'd like to just talk about an emerging, and there's not one, there's going to be lots of different Indigenous psychologies, knowledges, models, and paradigms that come into the area, and so it should be. It'll be exciting and rich. But one of the concepts that we've been working on is social and emotional wellbeing for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, and this actually came from work that was done by some of our founding people in Indigenous mental health, like Pat Swan, Helen Milroy, and so on. But social and emotional wellbeing, and the Indigenous psychologists have worked this further to the diagram that you see in front of you. But we say that a notion of selfhood or a concept of selfhood is limited unless it includes other things. It's not just about, your mind, as Western knowledges would have, but it's about your mind and emotions, but also your connection. What makes you a person is your connection to your family and your kinship. And family, again, is defined differently for Indigenous people. It's what defines you is your connection to your community, your connection to your culture, to your country, your spirituality and ancestors, and obviously in the first instance, we all occupy a physical space. But that in itself is not all the story. We are situated in a certain historical situation, and Indigenous people, we have had that history of colonisation which we are recovering from, and that needs to be taken into account for our struggles and our aspiration to name ourselves, name our realities. So that is important. Social determinants is another issue that needs to be considered, because from that story of colonisation, we are the most disadvantaged. The adverse social determinants impact on us most of all than any other group, and political determinants are likewise important. A lot of Indigenous issues it depends on the will of the government of the day, and I'm pleased to see some interesting and powerful movements happening where Indigenous people are claiming their own sovereignty. But on to the next slide. organisers. Can I do that myself? No, I'm trying to. The social emotional wellbeing framework, which has been well consulted all across Australia, because we've actually got a policy document in place with this. It's yet to be implemented properly though, but there's guiding principles that underpin the SEWB framework, and I'll just quickly go through it. And Mohi, just give me a signal when my time's up. But firstly, that health is holistic. You know, we don't separate everything up. You know, how can you have good health and good mental health if you don't have your good connections to land and ownership over your land? And everything's interrelated. Secondly, self-determination is central to the provision of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health services and mental health service. So we need to be in charge of what happens to us. We need to be part of the co-design process and be honoured as human beings who can make decisions about ourselves and our own people. Culturally valid understandings must shape the provision of services and assessment, care and management of Indigenous mental health problems in particular. And it must be recognised that, you know, we are part of a story of colonisation, and there's experience of trauma and loss, and that is part of our intergenerational trauma, is a part of our reality, and we need to space and resource to recover from that, to heal from that some of our people. The other guiding principles are human rights, that needs to be respected. And next slide. Okay, accepting too that racism, stigma, environmental adversity and social disadvantage, they continue to be realities, ongoing stresses for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, not only in Australia. I'd say these principles would be somewhat, you know, applicable all to other Indigenous peoples as well. The centrality of Aboriginal family and kinship must be recognised. That's really important for Aboriginal people, and it's a fundamental issue. The eighth principle is that there's no single Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander cultural group, but numerous groupings. So, and they might live in different circumstances and move between those, but we're all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. But often people think, you know, that we as a group of people are monolithic, but we are very diverse. Our historical experiences are diverse, and that always needs to be respected. And finally, it must be recognised that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people have great strengths, creativity and endurance, and a deep understanding of the relationship between human beings and their environment. So we come to the table with our own knowledges, which with our own strengths that can be shared. It's not while it is a story of colonisation, it's a story of resilience and rich culture that can be shared somewhat as well. So those are the SUB framework. We do have a policy in place. A movement has started. We've teach programs that ensure that we have all of those different domains as part of the programs that we do, the curriculum that we teach, and it resonates with community people. It values their reality and normal. It makes their culture normal. So I think that is an important a pathway that psychology can take, is to validate Indigenous knowledges and ways of being, and that strengthens our people, and it is a great decolonising strategy. And on that point, I'd like to end, Mohi. I don't know what my time's like, but that's enough for me. Thank you. Oh,
thank you, Pat. Appreciate that. Some great insights there. And now moving on to our second speaker, Professor Linda Waimaire Nikora. who is the co-director of Ngā Pai of Te Maramatanga from New Zealand. Handing it over to Linda.
Tēnā koe, Mohi. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's lovely to see the hands of friendship reaching out across this webinar context, and lovely to see friends that I've met before, and brilliant to meet new friends that have just called in for the day. And thanks, Chris and Karen and the team for enabling this to happen. So, ka nui te mihi atu ka koutou. I'm Waimaire. I currently work for Ngā Pai Te Maramatanga, co-director at the University of Auckland. But previous to that, I spent around about 27 odd years teaching community psychology at the University of Waikato here in New Zealand. And so when I left the University of Waikato, I didn't leave behind psychology. I very much took psychology with me. My view of psychology is that it can create absolute magic in the lives of people who are suffering and are of need to evolve their lives and contexts, etc., in more meaningful kinds of ways. So, you know, I chose psychology as a profession, as a discipline, because I recognised its helpfulness. But that doesn't mean to say that psychology hasn't areas in which it needs to actually improve in. And I guess Pat's already surveyed some of those issues. And what I want to do in my 10 minutes that's been allocated to me is just to give some movement to who Indigenous peoples are, what their aspirations are, and how we're organising to achieve the visions, the goals and objectives that we hold for ourselves. Indigenous peoples, and especially Māori, are really not that great at screaming their own praises and achievements. So what I'm going to do is cut to a little Skype video that was made for Ngā Pai Te Maramatanga. Some of you might recognise some of the people in this video, but Ngā Pai was established around about 17 years ago, and we'll track in the next 3 minutes some of that history. So hopefully you can all see that video.
Whaia ngā pai o te maramatanga, ko te pai tawhiti whaia kia tata, ko te pai tata whakamaua kia tīna, e putai ki te whaiao ki te ao marama. Pursue the many horizons of insight, bring each one closer, master them, and emerge enlightened. Ngā pai o te maramatanga, New Zealand's Māori Centre of Research Excellence.
Kia ora, and I'll just go to a screen share if I can. Looks like that one there. And I need to just run that. Okay, does that look okay?
Yep, that's fine, Linda.
Thanks. So I just want to pick up on the last slide from the video, and I hope it just gave you a little bit of an idea of the flavour of Ngā Pai Te Maramatanga. It's a network that's a national network of researchers that pushes back on the notion that Māori aren't academics and Māori aren't researchers. We are very much part of the modern world and engaged in all areas of the academy. And what's really important is if we're going to advance a Māori vision, if we're going to achieve that, then we have to be working together. We cannot be working in silos or contained by our institutions into our own little institutions. So what I want you to do is just have a look at this image, which is about our strategic leadership team. I don't want you to look so much at the names or the people, but I want you to look at the logos. And the logos sort of indicate the institutions that we're at. It's really, really difficult for many people to actually get beyond their institutional identity to be able to reach out to others who are working in similar areas. Because Indigenous peoples Māori are situated often in lone areas where they are the only one, or there's only small clusters of them. We find ourselves reaching out to each other right across our nation. There's a transition on this slide that will just go to some discipline areas. If community psychology, if psychology had answers to all the challenges that Indigenous peoples face, then the world would be a much better place. And we know that that is certainly not the case. And, you know, we have to get over the arrogance of our discipline training in terms of being able to bring all the answers that the globe needs to actually be a better place. So here you can see there are people with specializations in sociology, health science, medicine, physics, computer science, law, and indeed, I think that's Mohirua there, community psychology. And so Ngā Pai Te Maramatanga, Indigenous psychologists tend to be not only multidisciplinary in nature, but are able to actually mobilise and walk and respect and engage with multiple knowledge streams. And that's one of the huge value adds that Indigenous psychologists, Indigenous academics bring into the equation that the institution does not train us for. My institution did not train me in terms of Māori knowledge. My communities trained me in terms of Māori knowledge. And so bringing that all together in one particular place is a huge asset and an essential part of the infrastructure that we have within Aotearoa New Zealand. The other thing that I want to comment on is that we often hold up our institutional tags in terms of presenting ourselves to people, but everyone on the screen belongs to at least one Māori Indigenous community. Most would belong to more. And so our researchers right across the nation comprise and engage with hundreds and hundreds of Māori communities. And that's a real asset in terms of where we want to go to. Just moving on now, one of the other things that we've done in our organisation is thrown the discipline areas out the door. They're not helpful. They create a space where we end up siloed from each other and coming together in contested kinds of ways in terms of whose knowledge is better. So what we've done here is just simply said, okay, let's do away with the boundaries relative to our disciplines, and come together under these cluster areas and work as teams in order to actually move forward to achieve the goals that we wanted to achieve. Lastly, all I want to say is that, there are five points. In terms of moving our lives and our communities together, it's important that we move forward on the basis of our vision and our future, not somebody else's. So when a researcher or some other, for example, a community psychologist might knock on the door, I'm really curious to know what's their motivation for knocking on my door. What do they need? Do their needs correspond with what my needs are relative to an Indigenous vision and Indigenous future? We also require Indigenous leadership that's staunch to the future that we want to achieve, to the vision that we have, that we hold, and the way in which we want to go about achieving that vision. So Indigenous leadership, it's got to be clear, crystal clear. It's got to be staunch, but equally savvy. So when I say savvy, well-educated, bullshit radars up all over the place, and also able to negotiate across borders, across groups, etc. So relationships are everything. So there's a lot of talk, both in the past and presently, in terms of partnering, partnerships, co-partnerships, co-design. Again, I have to go back to the people who are approaching us relative to the co-design process and ask, what are their needs? What is it that they want? Not in order for me to satisfy their needs and wants, but in order for me to determine whether or not they have the same vision that we hold as a people. Oftentimes, Indigenous peoples are constructed as being always looking to the past. Rarely are we constructed as being future focused. And so I just simply want to say that the past goes with us everywhere. Context is everything. Relationships over place and time are everything. But that does not mean to say that we cannot actually see ourselves far into the future. And so part of the mission of Ngāpai o Te Maramatanga is to nurture solid foundations that in turn will produce the flourishing that we are seeking for both ourselves now and into the future. And lastly, we've got to be firmly grounded. If there's no planet, there's no future. So sustainability is everything. And so the decision-making that we engage in has to be conscious of all those things. There's a pandemic, there's inequities, there are floods, there's earthquakes, there's all sorts of things that are kind of like telling us that our time is running out in terms of the planet. We need to do something now. So no planet, no future, and indeed no Indigenous peoples or any peoples for that matter. And I think that's a real dire kind of scenario to have to face up to, but we have to start doing that with purpose and passion right now. So that's what I want to bring to the conversation this morning. And I look forward to the next speaker and to the Q&A that will follow. So kia ora.
Kia ora, Linda. Appreciate that. And also appreciate the point about relationships and everything. They can put the bullshit radar, as you put it, up at this point. So I appreciate your discussion and presentation, Linda. At this point, we're going to move to our third and final panelist. Nuria Ciofalo is a core professor of the Community Liberation and Indigenous and Eco-Psychology Specialization at Pacifica Graduate Institute. She's worked with Indigenous communities in Hawaii, northern, central, and southern Mexico for more than 40 years. She teaches Indigenous psychologies, centering Indigenous cosmologies, epistemologies, axiologies, and healing praxis. At this point, I hand it over to Nuria.
Thank you very much, Mohi, and thank you, Pat and Linda, for this gift that you have given me one more time. I would like to, start really showing my gratitude, because I have learned indigenous psychologies primarily from learnings from New Zealand and Australia in the 90s, when I decided to go to Hawaii to do community psychology there, to learn from the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. And then I learned all this abundance of epistemologies and praxeologies that could help to truly think and envision and imagine self-determination for our indigenous peoples in Mexico. I shared those learnings with some of the communities I was working in Mexico, and there was such an excitement to learn from you. So I hope we can continue to create those networks. I will share a screen with some slides for the sake of keeping the time contained of what I would like to say and not diverge too much, so that we can also focus on your questions. As Pat actually already and Linda approach the structural issues in terms of historical colonization and the acknowledgement that there is still a continuation of coloniality going on that is based on the doctrines of progress and civilization to justify the usurpation of territories, peoples, souls, knowledge systems, and trying to possess and appropriate all of that for the sake of power. They have caused epistemicide, losing knowledge systems, erasing them, not really losing them, but trying to marginalize them and devalue them, and creating a power system, a hegemonic regime of truth that only validates scientific knowledge as under a Western paradigm that emphasizes reason. So we don't want to get stuck just contesting these issues of historical colonization and coloniality as it continues to exist as a great power, and many issues that we have to confront to end its consequences. But we also acknowledge that there are abundant emergences as we have right now evidence that are moving and creating a pathway towards reimagining a different radical future toward decoloniality, in which, like the epistemologies of the global South have taught us, we can delink from Euro and US-centric epistemologies to avoid what de Sousa Santos in one of the authors of these epistemologies of the global South calls the abyssal thinking, so that Western hegemony has created this separation of all what is in this side of the line under white supremacist regimes of cosmovisions, ideologies, paradigms, ways of being are valid and unquestioned, and everybody else needs to follow to be labeled civilized or developed, and all what is in the other side is non-existent, inferior, in need for intervention, for progress and civilization. But it also creates a deep abyssal ignorance in the people that are practicing these separations. So if we could learn from knowledge systems that are based on how the Zapatistas also have inspired us to think of creating a world in which many worlds can exist, un mundo en donde muchos mundos puedan existir. We can look at emergences, for example, from the Latin American modernity, coloniality, decoloniality movement that centers the learnings from, for example, numerous indigenous movements throughout history that have taught us the struggle to maintain ecological sustainability and proofs of the way these many indigenous groups around the world have maintained the assets, ecological assets that we are now trying to preserve. So focusing on being aware of what Mignolo called the colonial difference that separates this abyssal thinking, as I said, in imposing Western knowledge and all what is not Western considered inferior, being aware and through constant reflexivity, because we have been socialized through educational systems that are completely in maintaining coloniality. Primarily, academy plays a huge role in doing that, and many other organizations, including some we know that are trying to pursue values of justice and equality that in the end also practice epistemic racism and do not center indigenous knowledge systems as ways of, as archives of knowledge from which we need to learn to address the imperative issues we are facing now. In this way, we can create a plurality of ecologies of knowledges, as these epistemologies of the Global South are teaching us, in which we learn from many examples of practices that are alternatives to capitalism, that exist outside of it, not within it or of it, at the margins of it, but truly creating other possibilities, reimagining different ways of being in this world. And that is what indigenous psychologies can offer us. It's a paradigm, a movement, an approach, a cosmovision from which we have to learn. That is now imperative demand for us to learn from these knowing systems, these knowledge systems, praxeologies that, as I said before, have proven to maintain the rich biodiversity of the localities that are inhabited by many of them. There is Ruiz Ponce, for example, a scholar from Oaxaca, an indigenous scholar from Oaxaca, Mexico, calls this a global call to bring the written and oral archives that are produced by indigenous intelligentsias, such as Pat and Linda's presenting us here, this abundance of such resources to be brought to the center of a new academia that creates and pursues decoloniality, that follows teachings from the rich teachings of the indigenous groups of South America, all the Americas, many other places as we're learning, New Zealand, Australia, and so more, that knowledge is embedded to create this new future that is based on a different kind of well-being that brings the rights of the earth and the rights of human other than human, not anthropocentric models of holistic development based on summa causae or the buen vivir that has been now made part of the constitution in some South American nations such as Bolivia and Ecuador. Practicing being conscious of the need to practice self-reflexivity, to be aware of maintaining epistemic resistance and disobedience towards epistemic justice, centered in these written and oral archives of indigenous psychologies, and pursuing the colonial solidarity to avoid, as Land, Cobal, or Tucanyang and others have alerted us, to become conscious of the white saber complex in creating patterns of partnerships or collaborations that perpetuate coloniality instead of truly learning to co-create this otherwise. And I have learned in indigenous communities to create co-create projects that bring their ancestral legends. And for example, in the Mayan Lacandon community, I work with different generations, children and adult leaders who were educators and brought their ancestral legends to their school system. The children performed them and brought them back to the community based on a deep respect on effective conviviality with other than human beings and all our relations that surround their magnificent rainforest that still preserves their biodiversity. So community theater and art-based inquiry became one of the tools to work with them. I involved the children also in dream circles because this Maya Lacandon culture places a huge value on dreams as a means for prophetic imagination and also understanding of the present. And the children brought the story about a danger, a threat that was also mythological, based on their god Kisin, the god of the dead, who was threatening them to destroy their rainforest. But they banded together to kick this threat out and preserve peace in their community. So I also engage indigenous leaders, young community leaders who had graduated from local universities in that are truly an example because they are centering the indigenous knowledges and praxis in those academic institutions, and the graduates are coming back to their communities, as also Linda showed us in New Zealand and Pat in Australia. But these are very few developments that are happening in Mexico. I wish we will have more stronger presence of such institutions. So the youth who just had graduated from the university brought a book together with me, and I also engaged leaders in the community from northern to Mexico, from the Kumeyaay community that is adjacent to U.S., where the Kumeyaay community also exists and is crossed by the U.S. border, dividing and separating them. This is a video where they share their own cosmovisions and in unison proclaim global solidarity to preserve and maintain the rich biodiversity of the regions. So engaging in methodologies that I learned along the way, seeing how other people taught me to do that. So two of them is Eduardo Almeida, a Mexican community psychologist, and his partner, Maria Eugenia Sanchez Diaz de Rivera, who told me how to be in constant presence in the communities, truly committing with effective conviviality, developing deep relationships, not being shy that this can go up and down and create utopia and conflict, but engaging in, as they told me, with openness, humility, and trust, creating niches to expand the emergence of written and oral archives of this new indigenous intelligentsia that are truly outstanding. These young people, Ernesto Chancayun, Maria Esther Velázquez, Carlos Chambord, Maria Esther led they organize 2 different communities or 2 different ethnicities to create this non-governmental organization to preserve their beloved rainforest. And so we are celebrating our work together, in which each of them brought a chapter together with other community leaders who are sharing their rich cosmologies, the rich epistemologies, and their ancestral praxis, as well as the new ones. As Linda said, it's not just based on the past. There are many new and creative models for us to learn from, as I said, to create a radical different future towards the otherwise. And so if I have shared these slides with the organizers, and if you are interested, you can view the videos in which we all participated, and many other community members, in a kind of participatory videography to bring their abundant knowledge, sharing how they have preserved one of the richest biodiversity regions of the world. Muchas gracias.
Cheers. Thank you, Nuria. That was awesome. I acknowledge Pat's first presentation, Linda, and of course finishing with Nuria. And at this point, we'd like to move into the Q&A session, and we've got a bunch of questions up here already. So I might start from the top if that's okay. And the first question is actually to Pat. Do you believe that the general health of a nation is highly dependent upon the health and well-being of its Indigenous First Nations people?
Look, absolutely. I just can't see, and it's reasonable. How can we go forward as any civil society when there's people in it, particularly the Indigenous people, that are very marginalised and oppressed and suffer great disadvantage. So I think there's a whole lot of ethical issues in any given society. We should be striving for that all people are equal, but celebrating their own particular cultures. I think for settler nations like ours, being Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the States, there's a particular issue that the Indigenous people were decimated. They were suffered terrible colonisation, and that needs to there's a social justice issue. But as already this webinar has highlighted, Indigenous knowledges have much to offer. In the first instance, we want to celebrate our own Indigenous knowledges for ourselves, but they're not just for us. There's spaces in there where it can be shared, but until we become societies that are all inclusive and we respect, empower and value all the different people and cultures that make us up, we can't go forward.
Cheers. Thank you, Pat. There's another question here, and this is for all the panelists actually. What advice would the panelists have for young Indigenous peoples considering psychology as a career?
Linda.
Kia ora. Thank you for the question. As I said in my presentation, I've seen psychologists do absolute magic and change people's lives for really, really positive outcomes. So I think that for Indigenous peoples moving into the academy, wanting to have that outcome, i.e. to be able to help relieve suffering, which is the fundamental mission of psychologists, then you've got to hold that vision for yourself really, really closely as you're moving through the academy. There is lots to learn, and when I moved through the academy, I had my bullshit detector up saying, yep, that's great. This is going to work in terms of the people that I know and the places that I walk through and the aspirations that I have. And then I look at other things and say, who would have ever thought of that? That's not going to be useful at all in terms of the people that I go through. I think at the end of the day, coming out the other end of psychology, you are changed. You're a different person. You're not the same person that you are when you entered into the establishment. And neither am I. But what I've been able to do is integrate the good and the useful from psychology into the vision that I have in terms of the things that I want to do and achieve. So psychology is a set of tools. It's not your identity. It's not your life way. It's a set of tools and skills that are useful in terms of where you want to go with it.
Cheers, thank you, Linda. And there's a second part to this question, which again to the whole panel. How do Indigenous peoples move through Western psychology training into Indigenous decolonial community psychology?
Oh, look, I'll go, but I'll invite the other panelists to speak as well. I think there's new spaces opening up now. We've got this project happening in Australia called the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project, and we're about to revive it. But when we started it, and this is going back, 2011, 12, it was very difficult. We were looking at increasing the number of Indigenous psychologists, but also putting Indigenous studies into psych curriculum. And it was very difficult. People were saying, schools of psychology were saying, their curriculums were full, they couldn't include, blah, blah, blah. Now, however, there's a sea change that's happened. So I think that, there's going to be a new psychology in the near future, and it will be different to what used to happen. Well, I hope that's the case. In any case, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but we're talking to people, psychology schools who are doing radical things. Some are just having, a stream of Indigenous psychology, but others are really stepping outside the square and looking at even different ways of teaching an Indigenous psychology. So I think there's this movement that started up, and I think it is important. We need Indigenous people in psychology. We need them in all the disciplines. And there's some good things that, that are already there. We shouldn't, as Linda said, throw out the baby with the bathwater. But certainly I think the paradigm changes are happening now, and they're exciting and good. And I think people can be certainly a part of them.
Thanks, Pat. I don't know if anybody else would like to comment. We've got a bunch of questions you can all answer. Next question. Okay. To all the presenters, how would Indigenous movements address, anticipate, or handle separatist movements? This is related to Indigenous and national identities. For example, in Indonesia, there are more than 300 Indigenous ethnics, and some of them really want to be separated from Indonesia. Happy to read that question again.
Maybe Nuria wants to have the first shot at that one.
Oh, well, I think you are closer to matters of Indonesia than I can answer, but I can, find some similarities with conflicts and situations that are happening in Mexico, in my country. Many times those separations are promoted by the government, even by international intrusion in Mexican politics, because of the fear that can happen. Their fear that if Indigenous peoples unite, there will be a true change. So I don't know if that is the situation in Indonesia. And for my own experience in Mexico, for example, the Bajan Lacandon, even though right in the region, the Zapatist movement exists and they are surrounded by it, they chose not to join them. I wouldn't see this as separatist, but you know, that's part of the culture in making decisions towards mobilizations rather guided by, for example, sustaining the biodiversity of the rainforest and asking the government to keep it intact and not intervene as it had done historically, also giving land to other ethnicities and created conflict through it, not respecting the that some lands cannot be inhabited for agriculture or raising animals, etc. So our conflicts many times raised by power holders. So I'm not sure, and sometimes as decisions from the tribes themselves, and I would say that needs to be respected as well, if that is the case.
If I can just make a comment, Mohi, and kia ora, Edward, lovely to hear from you again. I'm not adequately versed in the Indonesian context to be able to respond to the specifics, but I can actually speak back into my own context. And the first thing I want to say is about the term separatism. It's often seen as a frightening notion that people want to separate themselves away from a larger group for whatever reason that may be. And so I think the first thing we need to do is say, okay, well, this is not such a scary idea. Just because people want to go and sit on the other side of the fence and do their thing and be happy doing it, we shouldn't get upset about that. I know here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the term separatist is seen or is cast upon us because we are not seen as supporting the status quo. But that's not the case at all. It's just that, we've got our things, our business that we want to get on with, and that's fine. Again, speaking back into the New Zealand context, Māori are tribal people. The collective term that's often used is Māori, but we do have our own separate tribal identities. They're each sovereign nations and entities in and of themselves, and we learn to treat well with each other, yet coexist in separate kinds of ways. So, the thing for me is that I'm all for pluralism. I'm all for people having their own aspirations in terms of how they want to evolve their futures. What I think perhaps is the issue is the context in which they're doing that, the politics, the things that polarize people within a society, the inequities, the disadvantages that are created for different groups within society. I think that's the issue. It's not the issue of whether or not they want to be a separatist, radical kind of entity.
Well, I think Linda and Nuria have answered the question very well, but I think as I was listening and agreeing in my, I think that for us, speaking as psychologists, those are questions that will always confront us, whatever discipline we study in, but psychology, which tries to, be scientific and objective and away from the politics of the world and whatnot, is that we're part of a society, and I think we will be asked to make ethical decisions and stands at various times, and we need to be prepared to do that, and be ethical and support particularly movements of the those who've been oppressed, striving for their own empowerment and social justice.
Thank you all. This question is for Nuria, but the whole panel can reflect upon it as well. Do you believe that we are currently experiencing a global spiritual emergency, with the climate emergency being the most obvious, that requires Indigenous wisdom and knowledge systems to help navigate us?
Yes, I mean, I think that we have been experiencing that global spiritual emergency a long time ago, and we haven't listened, to Indigenous paradigms that were not just like preaching and putting it in writing, just showing also in praxis, and we have the outcome, as I said, from the regions where most of the biodiversity exists are inhabited by Indigenous people, so they can teach us how to use those practices to overcome the ecocide that has been caused by colonization. So that emergency happened since then. And definitely that's exactly what I advocate, that we need to change the paradigm. Like the scholars from the Global South said, not just the contents, but also the terms of conversation, and create an academia that, as I said, is not complicit with perpetuating this situation, but bringing these paradigms to the center so we can create a radical change.
Thank you. And this question might link in with that, Nuria and Pat, Linda. How do we continue to push boundaries in developing and disseminating Indigenous knowledge and practice while working in a system steeped in Euro and US-centric coloniality? Anyone?
That is a good question, a big one. I think us having this, it's changing. I think that sometimes, we go to those, I've gone to those big, again, I'm going to stay with psychology because that's a good example. I go to those big international psychology conferences, and you forget there's that powerful Western hegemony out there, and where it's so ethnocentric. But it is changing as well. The fact that we can have webinars like this, I think that with the climate change, Black Lives Matter movement, and so on, people of we've always known it. We've always been positioned in a situation of or position of resistance, but I think that all people are starting to look very critically at society and starting to challenge it. So I think we're seeing, and I hope I'm not being a Pollyanna and overly optimistic, but I think a change is coming. I think people have had enough. I think they're really worried about climate change, as we all are, and we all should be. But we're worried about social justice, so I think there's a change coming. So I think that will start to happen, and we will be a part of that. I hope that each of us will make sure that comes about in all the little things that we do. So we're all a part of it too. We're all, little droplets in a wave of change that needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, if I can add, how do you continue to push boundaries? It's hard. A lot of Indigenous academics are situated in toxic environments within toxic and uninviting and unwelcoming environments within the academy, and that's what they go to work to every day. And we develop our coping strategies along the way to enable us to get through our day, to keep pushing the boundaries, etc. Some of you may be aware of some of the activities and actions happening in universities in New Zealand at the moment in terms of Māori academics pushing back against the establishment, calling for reviews of our whole sector, not just one university, but the whole of our university sector relative to systemic racism, structural racism. Universities are highly sophisticated places, and academics and researchers are highly sophisticated people. So the nature of the racism, the nature of the discrimination that is faced by Indigenous academics is a sophisticated system, and it's not going to be easy to unpack that. But we just got to keep forging ahead and keep those activities on the boil, and make sure that we as Indigenous academics don't lose our vision in the process.
Yes, I totally agree, and I think that it is quite difficult to be inserted in the belly of the beast, recognizing the impacts that academia has had and continues to have, as said, in this complicity with coloniality and racism. But there is always hope that you can create islands and start changing the structures, and I'm very hopeful by seeing this centering of your knowledges, Linda and Pat, and bringing examples of universities that have departments of Indigenous psychologists, for example, that are not very common in other places of the world, and learning to create those spaces by banding together and creating networks of solidarity, moving key organizations. In my case, because I'm Mexican, but I am in the U.S. In Mexico, California, but part of the hegemony of the U.S. We have an organization here, the Society for Community Research and Action, that, in my opinion, barely has centered Indigenous psychologists as a key, area that needs to be embraced and promoted. And then I would just like to add as well that in my opinion, Indigenous psychologists, as you both have also demonstrated, is transdisciplinary, and it doesn't have the silos of the Western fragmentation of worldviews and rationality and division between what is rational and irrational, or develop or not develop. All these binaries that doesn't exist. So that's a huge change to start, raising or this kind of awareness in a new student generation who doesn't think that way. That is truly breaking with patterns. It's difficult, but it has happened, and that gives me so much hope that we can continue making the road together towards this otherwise that can be imagined and made possible.
Cheers, thank you. Maybe extending on the point, Nuria, there's a question here for you, Linda, and it really relates to this transdisciplinary idea. The question is, how did you put a multidisciplinary team together for Ngā Pae o Te Maramatanga? How does it work? What are some of the tensions? What are some of the positive overlaps, etc.?
That's a great question, Mohi, and thank you. As in the opening clip said, it's been an organisation around for the last 18 years, and I've come into the co-directorship role in the last 3 years. So much of the infrastructure had already been built by people like Professor Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who was a founding director of Ngā Pae, Michael Walker, Tracy McIntosh, and who spent the best part of a decade making relationships For Indigenous peoples who are academics who are situated apart from each other in different institutions and disciplines and things like that, to have a national network of Māori Indigenous researchers was just simply a godsend. And so, the majority of Māori researchers in the country are connected into that network in some form or fashion. The other part is the commonality for us is Indigenous knowledge, mātauranga Māori. Having flourishing Māori futures as a shared aspiration, a shared vision and goal that all of our researchers are committed to. And being called into to leadership positions, a strategic leadership team, is very different to being called into being head of school or head of a faculty or some other administrative role within a university. So I think we provide an attractive place for our Indigenous researchers and academics to come together. We provide an attractive catch, cry and banner to work towards, vision to work towards, and we provide the capability and the skill and the networks into communities, not just in Aotearoa but internationally, for people to actually operate in. And that for me is very different to a lot of the toxic environments that our researchers people are actually working in. So,
staying with you, Linda, a question here. In your presentation, can you please expand upon complicity? You talked to complicity in your presentation. Can you suggest some way, expand upon that and suggest some ways to overcome this?
So I don't think I used the term complicity in my presentation, but I do understand what it means, and I'm happy to infer that. And obviously someone picked up on that. So I think that, there are allies, people that we work with, even friends and family, that are complicit in allowing racism, discrimination, stereotyping, the whole colonial machine, capitalist machine to continue to roll over us in some form or fashion. We've got to be aware that, I'm not free of colonial trappings, if you like, irrespective of how those trappings might appear. So it might appear in having a colonial English name. It might appear in different ways in which I think. It might appear in my lack of reading a text from a critical perspective. So like in the last week, I've had discussions with students about the nature of gender in the Pacific and the way in which the Christianity just totally screwed with all of that, pardon the pun. But yes, we can all be complicit, Indigenous peoples as well as others. However, I don't see that as a bad thing. It becomes a bad thing when you are conscious of that complicity and you then act to manipulate others with it. If you're simply ignorant of it and you're sort of happy to be sort of pulled up and says, hey, you need to be looking at it this way, or you need to be actually thinking about these things, and that's another matter. Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. We have a question here, and it's aimed at you, for you, Pat, though I think the panel can also respond. Will Australia have to become a republic before we can be truly decolonized in our thinking and practices?
No, look, I don't think so. I think there's this movement that's afoot right now about called the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that there should be Indigenous representation in Parliament. So that movement's happening, and I think that's the way forward. I think that, amongst other things, I don't think it's ever going to be one thing. We've got some really powerful groups that are doing things, and perhaps my vision or what I see, it depends on where I'm situated, obviously in health, mental health, but there's the health leadership is doing a lot in the area as well. So I think it's going to be a lot of things. There's a movement that's looking at getting a coalition of peaks, so we're a part of decision making, government decision making. That's connected to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So there's political movements afoot, but also structural change that some of our leaders are advocating for. So I think that that just having a different, I don't know if a republic's going to sort that or whether it is the movement that's happening from the people themselves. But it is changing. It is changing. We sometimes we go 2 steps forward and 1 back. So, but I think it'll have to be attitude change as well as structural change. So, and that is happening. I mean, I think, again, the racism is more, it's still there, but it's more easily to be identified and challenged nowadays.
Thank you, Pat.
I'm happy for anyone else to answer that. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm leaving that open, but there are plenty of other questions too, but I'm leaving that one open if anybody else would like to add on to what Pat talked to. Okay. To the panel, can Indigenous knowledge systems help us understand why it's taken a huge global climate crisis to begin to break down prejudices and begin to engage in international collaboration?
Say again, Mohi?
Yep. Can Indigenous knowledge systems help us understand why it's taken a huge global climate crisis to begin to break down prejudices and begin to engage in international collaboration?
Okay, I'll venture a start to answer that question. I don't think it's, international collaborations have been going on for decades, centuries, and I don't think that it's simply been a result of issues of climate change. Maybe that's just an opening on that question. I think that, can Indigenous knowledges help to present a positive response to the issues of climate change? Absolutely. And for me, it's a no-brainer. What I can't understand is why haven't we got an emergency? Because there's not much urgency out there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree as well. I think that it's not been just about climate change, although that certainly is a pinpoint. That's pinned the whole issue down. I think there's a lot of change. I think we, obviously, Indigenous knowledges can contribute to this positive change that's urgently required. But there's a lot of other things that are happening across the world. I recently started tweeting a year ago, and that's been, there's a lot of rubbish on there, but there's a lot of good things too that, you see. And obviously my tweet stream picks up what I'm interested in, which I've pressed like for and whatnot. But there's a lot of really bold, different ways of using energy that could be incorporated into any society. With Linda, I think too, well, why aren't we doing it now? And it is a bit frightening. But certainly Indigenous knowledges can play a part in there, and I'm with Linda. It's a bit daunting actually, and we need to start moving now. But our youth have been, there was that youth movement against climate change. A little bit invisible in that was the Indigenous youth that were a part of that too. So we have been advocating, and hopefully things will happen before it is too late.
Nuria, if you can unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Yes, I was just saying that I agree with both you and Pat and Linda what you stated, and definitely think that, in my opinion at least, the climate change issue has been faced because we have pursued a monopolistic approach to dealing with nature that has been seen as commodity within that Western paradigm, and on all what it implicated, the science and usurpation of lands and power and capital, and creating this capitalist system. But Indigenous movements have been present all the time, contesting these usurpations towards nature and demanding the respect for territories and lands. I would like to connect with a question here that appears in Spanish from Eduardo Almeida, who is stating that the experience of the Indigenous peoples is key now, and that we comment in that regard. I think that, well, my way of answering this will be that these experiences are truly showing us that we need to create the otherwise, that what has happened so far is not sustainable and has created all these catastrophes we are experiencing, from racism to ecocide, epistemicide, as we were talking about. But I'm leaving this and this question also to Pat and Linda. Regarding the experience of Indigenous peoples, in the case of Mexico, there have been many movements, and all over the Americas, demanding the respect for nature, and nature having a right, and also demanding the equality and social justice of their enough, ya basta, exploitation of people's lands, and their spirituality being also the driver of a different way of existing.
Absolutely. That had, there's been resistance and protests since colonisation, and they are about the people themselves, but their land and the use of, everything on the land. And I think capitalism is you nailed it there, Nuria. It is capitalism, where everything's seen as commodity, and anyone can grab it up and use it, and there's no consequences, that we can take animals and do these terrible mass farming and mass killing of them without any consequences. There will be consequences, and I think Indigenous people have always protested about that, because most Indigenous people had systems in place that respected the land and nature, and with colonisations they were destroyed. So going back to that certainly is a way. I mean, we can never go back entirely to a pure way, a pure Indigenous or a pure whatever way, but I think we can look for useful fusions, and that probably is our future.
Yeah, I think, you both nailed it. And, I'm just reflecting on the whole COVID-19 pandemic and the ways in which countries put their populations under restrictions, into lockdown and the like. And what you can see there is where there is political will to keep populations safe, then they will act to do so. and so I come back to the issue of climate change, which the pandemic is part of that. There's huge issues involved in climate change. If there were political will to advance the achievement of carbon neutrality, for example, then we'd get there much faster. And so, there are lots and lots of other systems at play here that are preventing significant progress, and it's the progress that we really, really need right now to be happening.
Cool. Nuria, there's another question by Eduardo. There's one above it, and it refers to COVID-19.
Yes, let me see. He's saying that the human condition is fragile. It's based on fragility, uncertainty, and absurdity. And COVID-19 has made this patent universal of these characteristics. COVID-19 has made universal these characteristics. It's made evident.
Yes, we are fragile.
And absurd. And uncertain, definitely, yes. Yes.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, please go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm just going to check with the events organisers what time we have left. I believe we're coming to the end shortly, but we've still got a couple of questions. Is there a place for collaboration between Indigenous knowledges across regions or countries? And do you have any tips on how to integrate and learn from each other?
Read the Indigenous journals.
Yeah, there is.
Change what you're reading.
Yeah.
The Indigenous academics publishing work out there, sharing the experiences and whatnot. There are Indigenous conferences that are occurring right across the world. And so it's not as if Indigenous people don't want to share their knowledge, and it's about being in the right place to receive it. We've got an international online conference coming up in November on Indigenous research, where those collaborations, those knowledges are being shared, and there are others that are occurring around the globe. Change your reading list.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a lot of knowledge exchange happening amongst Indigenous people. And, we've got the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights in any case. So that's been happening for years and years across a range of different knowledge areas. So that is happening. And we do have Indigenous psychology networks, with the APA, the task force, and we're looking at developing our own. We're part of a global Indigenous psychology network with Moana from New Zealand. So there's a lot of collaboration between Australia and New Zealand, at least in that particular area. But it's been happening for some time now, that exchange, and at all different topic areas as well.
Mm-hmm. But I think that we need to strengthen that to the American continent, creating more collaboration and more networks. As I said, expanding the presence of Indigenous Psychologies departments and maybe creating more academic exchange experiences with students. I think that will be a great thing, where we learn other languages because, at least in US, for example, you barely find people who speak other languages except English, and there are not too many relationships with the other Americas, being Mexico and all these other countries in South America. Learning from movements as the Zapatista movement and the education and health institutions that they have created, and allowing their voices to be also exchanged with all those of other Indigenous movements around the world. I think if we could collaborate through organizations or banding together to create those networks. It will be a beautiful way for reimagining a radical future.
Yes, thank you. Hey, we've got one last question to wrap up, and apologies to those people who submitted questions and we couldn't get to them. One last question. Sexuality, gender, and sexual orientation from the last bastion of colonial values in Africa and the Pacific. In some places, it's still a capital offence. How can community psychology address this?
We've been doing a lot of work in Indigenous suicide prevention, and I think that one of our findings and what we enact to is about self-determination. That we know within our group there's other vulnerable groups like youth, LGBTIQ, and so on. But we can't speak for LGBTIQ. We need to we provide safe spaces and resources for our people to come together and speak upon those issues, and they need to lead it. So yes, obviously, if people are, if it's there's penalties for expressing your gender identity, we need to fight against that. But we also need to ensure that our own LGBTIQ people are leading that, and our positions are in the back seat. But we need to stand strong with them if it is a dire situation.
Kia ora, Mohi, and thank you, Nuria, for that question. Look, there are many ways of expressing our humanity and celebrating the relationships that we have with each other. And sexuality is just one such expression of our humanity. Certainly within the Pacific, those expressions of sexuality have been seriously sort of damaged by Christianity. And one of the great things I think that's also happening in the Pacific is not so much a pushback against Christianity, but simply assertions of gender identity that are traditional, that are valued, that are welcomed, that are celebrated, alongside the Victorian sensibilities, if you like. And so, from my view, the issue is one of plurality, celebrating those expressions, celebrating of those, of different ways of being human, and simply ensuring that in our celebratory moments we're not causing any harm, because I also recognise that it's a space where harm can be created, and Pat's touched on that. So.
Cool. Well, that was a great session. Covered a lot of ground. Thank you to the panel. I'm going to hand it over to Karen to finish it off now, but really appreciate the answers, really appreciate people looking in and submitting their questions, and thank you for your time. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Karen.
Thank you. Thanks, Mohi, and thanks, Nuria, Linda, and Pat. What an energising and enlightening panel. I really thank you a lot. There was so many issues that we need to reflect on going forward. From systemic racism to Western doctrines and systems to climate change to the place of Indigenous knowledges and the importance of country in place, and that's really important for the work that we do at Moondani Balak. But I think what I got most out of it is that, that our differences and our context is really important, and that we're in a space where we can reimagine and create foundations to flourish and enable, his social and emotional well-being that, that can shift or, give space to our give space and celebrate our diversity, while we're also taking control and empowering ourselves and our communities so that we can foster and sustain solidarities and to make a wave of change. I want to be on that wave. I'm going to ride that wave into that change for our communities, for our international collaborations, and, as amazing Black people. So thank you so much, and thank you to all the participants, and thank you to all the people who have supported this, and Victoria University and BU Events. Thanks, Big Mobs. Cheers.
Thank you.